On January 24th, 1965, the world mourned a giant, a man who had tasted both crushing defeat and glorious victory, who fell from grace only to rise again when humanity needed him most. This is the story of Winston Churchill, the aristocrat who became a soldier, the politician who was exiled to the wilderness, and the leader who stood alone against the darkness of Nazi Germany when the entire world seemed ready to surrender. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill entered this world on November 30th, 1874, not in a hospital, but in the opulent halls of Blenheim Palace, the same ancestral home where his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, had once planned victories against the armies of Louis XIV. His mother, the beautiful American socialite Jenny Jerome, had gone into labor prematurely during a grand ball, and Winston arrived 2 months early, as if he couldn't wait to begin his tumultuous journey through life. But behind the golden facade of aristocratic privilege lay a childhood marked by profound loneliness and academic struggle. Young Winston was raised by his beloved nanny, Mrs. Everest, while his brilliant but distant father, Lord Randolph Churchill, pursued his own meteoric political career. At St. George's School in Ascot, 7-year-old Winston was beaten regularly for his poor academic performance, his sensitive nature crushed under the harsh discipline of Victorian boarding school life. When he transferred to Harrow School at 13, Churchill remained at the bottom of his class, struggling with Latin and mathematics, while his keen mind yearned for history and literature. His father, already showing signs of the illness that would kill him at just 45, viewed his son as a disappointment, a failure who could never live up to the Churchill name. It took Winston 3 attempts to pass the entrance exam for the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, each failure deepening his father's disappointment. Yet when he finally succeeded in 1893, something remarkable happened. For the first time in his life, Winston Churchill found his calling. At Sandhurst, where military strategy and leadership mattered more than conjugating Latin verbs, Churchill excelled, graduating 20th out of 130 cadets.
By 1895, 20-year-old Winston Churchill was desperate for glory, craving the action and adventure that would prove his worth to a world that had dismissed him as a failure. As a young cavalry officer with the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, he didn't wait for war to come to him. He went hunting for it. Churchill's first taste of combat came in Cuba, where he rode alongside Spanish forces fighting Cuban rebels, bullets whistling past his head as he celebrated his 21st birthday under fire. But this was just the beginning of his relentless pursuit of danger and fame. In 1897, Churchill attached himself to a British expedition on India's northwest frontier, where he fought Pathan tribesmen in the rugged mountains of what is now Pakistan. He wrote to his mother, "I rode my gray pony all along the skirmish line, where everyone else was lying down in cover. Foolish, perhaps, but I play for high stakes, and given an audience, there is no act too daring or too noble." His next adventure took him to the Sudan, where in 1898, he participated in the last great cavalry charge in British military history, at the Battle of Omdurman. Churchill, saber in hand, thundered across the desert alongside the 21st Lancers as they smashed into the ranks of the Khalifa's warriors. The carnage was overwhelming. 11,000 enemy soldiers lay dead on the field when the sun set that evening. But it was in South Africa, during the Boer War, that Churchill's legend truly began. Serving as a war correspondent for the Morning Post, he was aboard an armored train when Boer commandos ambushed it on November 15, 1899. As locomotives derailed and bullets flew, Churchill helped organize the rescue of wounded soldiers, displaying the courage under fire that would define his entire life. Yet courage couldn't save him from capture. The Boers took Churchill prisoner and transported him to a POW camp in Pretoria. For a man of action like Churchill, confinement was torture, but it also presented opportunity. On the night of December 12, 1899, Churchill scaled the prison wall and vanished into the South African wilderness. For 3 weeks, he trekked across 300 miles of enemy territory, hiding in mines, dodging Boer patrols, and surviving on the kindness of strangers. When he finally reached safety, Churchill had become a household name across the British Empire. The young man who had failed at everything. Fame opened doors that failure had kept locked. In 1900, riding the wave of his heroic reputation, Churchill won election to Parliament as a Conservative MP. But Winston Churchill was never a man to follow party lines when his conscience demanded otherwise. In 1904, he stunned the political establishment by defecting to the Liberal Party, declaring, "I am an English liberal. I hate the Tory party." His political rise was meteoric. By 1908, he was president of the Board of Trade, championing workers' rights and social reform. In 1910, he became Home Secretary, and by 1911, at just 36 years old, Churchill reached the pinnacle of his early career as First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the Royal Navy. When World War I erupted in August 1914, Churchill threw himself into the conflict with characteristic intensity. He modernized the fleet, expanded naval aviation, and even personally led the defense of Antwerp, much to the horror of his colleagues, who watched their naval minister donning military uniform and heading for the trenches. But then came the decision that would haunt Churchill for decades: the Dardanelles expedition, better known as Gallipoli. Churchill's plan was audacious: force the narrow straits of the Dardanelles, capture Constantinople, knock Turkey out of the war, and open a supply route to Russia. On paper, it was brilliant strategy. In reality, it became one of the most catastrophic military disasters in British history. The naval attack of March 18, 1915 was a bloodbath. 3 battleships were sunk, and 3 more severely damaged by Turkish mines and artillery. When Allied forces finally landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula, they found themselves trapped on narrow beaches under murderous Turkish fire. Over 8 months, 46,000 Allied soldiers died, with over 250,000 wounded, all for virtually no territorial gain. Churchill, the architect of the disaster, became a political pariah overnight. On May 24, 1915, he was stripped of his position at the Admiralty and given the meaningless title of Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. His political career seemed finished at 40 years old. Broken and humiliated, Churchill resigned from government in November 1915 and did something that shocked everyone who knew him. He returned to the trenches. The 1920s brought Churchill back from the trenches, but not back to prominence. He held various ministerial positions, but his reputation remained tarnished by Gallipoli. Worse still, Churchill seemed increasingly out of step with the times. In 1929, the Conservative Party lost power, and Churchill found himself not just out of government, but increasingly isolated within his own party. He had opposed Indian independence, defended the British Empire when the world was moving toward decolonization, and made the catastrophic decision to return Britain to the gold standard, which deepened economic depression. For 10 years, from 1929 to 1939, Churchill wandered in what he would later call the wilderness years. He was a man without a party, without power, without influence. Politicians dismissed him as a warmonger, a relic of Victorian imperialism who had outlived his usefulness. During these dark years, Churchill threw himself into writing, producing magnificent biographies and histories, while his political career seemed permanently finished. He warned constantly about the growing threat of Nazi Germany, but few listened. His speeches in Parliament fell on deaf ears. His articles in newspapers were dismissed as the ravings of a bitter old man seeking relevance. By 1938, when Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich waving his piece of paper and promising peace for our time, Churchill stood almost alone in Parliament, warning that Britain had chosen dishonor and would get war anyway. Most MPs ignored him. Some actively despised him for his constant criticism of appeasement. As Hitler's armies massed on Poland's borders in the summer of 1939, Winston Churchill seemed like a politician whose time had passed forever. But history has a way of calling forth the right leader at the right moment. And when World War II erupted on September 3, 1939, Prime Minister Chamberlain made a remarkable decision. He recalled Winston Churchill to the Admiralty. After nearly 25 years away from naval command, Churchill was back in his old office, and the signal went out to the fleet. Winston is back. For 8 months, Churchill served loyally under Chamberlain,
But the disastrous Norway campaign in April 1940 finally broke the prime minister's credibility. When German forces invaded France and the Low Countries on May 10, 1940, the crisis demanded new leadership. At 6 p.m. that evening, King George VI asked Winston Churchill to form a government. At 65, an age when most men retire, Churchill finally achieved his life's ambition. But he inherited a nation facing extinction. Within weeks, France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk, and Nazi Germany controlled Europe from the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees. Britain stood alone, its back to the wall, facing an enemy that had conquered nations in weeks and seemed invincible. Lesser men would have sought terms with Hitler. Indeed, some in Churchill's own cabinet urged negotiation. But on June 4, 1940, Churchill stood before the House of Commons and delivered words that would echo through history. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." 18 days later, as German bombers prepared to darken British skies, Churchill again addressed Parliament with words that captured the moment's gravity and promise. "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, 'This was their finest hour.'" Through the dark summer and autumn of 1940, as Hitler's Luftwaffe pounded British cities and the Royal Air Force fought for national survival, Churchill's voice became the voice of resistance itself. His speeches, broadcast worldwide, rallied not just Britain, but all who still believed in freedom. When the Battle of Britain ended in October 1940, Hitler postponed his invasion plans indefinitely.
The war was far from over. For 4 more years, Churchill led Britain and her growing alliance of nations through the grinding campaigns that would ultimately destroy Nazi Germany. He forged the critical partnership with Franklin Roosevelt that brought America into the war, endured the devastating alliance with Stalin that was necessary for victory, and never wavered in his conviction that only total victory would suffice. The man who had orchestrated the Gallipoli disaster now helped plan D-Day. The politician who had been dismissed as a warmonger became the voice of civilization's fight against barbarism. The aristocrat who had struggled at school became history's most quotable leader, his words inspiring millions to continue fighting when defeat seemed certain. Yet even as victory approached, Churchill could see the next great threat emerging. While celebrating with Stalin and Roosevelt, he recognized that the Soviet dictator posed a new danger to the freedom they had fought to preserve. When the war ended in May 1945, Winston Churchill seemed unassailable. The savior of democracy, the lion who had defied the Nazi storm. Yet just 2 months later, British voters did the unthinkable. They threw him out of office in a landslide election victory for the Labour Party. Churchill was devastated. The British people, grateful for his wartime leadership but eager for social change, had chosen new leaders for peacetime. Once again, Winston Churchill found himself in opposition. But this time, his warnings about a new threat found a more receptive audience. On March 5, 1946, at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, Churchill delivered perhaps his most prophetic speech. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. With these words, he helped launch the Cold War and warned the world about Soviet intentions years before others recognized the threat. Churchill returned to power as prime minister from 1951 to 1955, but age was catching up with the old lion. Still, his literary achievements brought him the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953, recognizing his masterful 6-volume history of World War II and his lifetime of magnificent prose.
On January 24, 1965, exactly 70 years after his father's death,
Winston Spencer Churchill died peacefully at his London home. He was 90 years old, having lived through the reigns of 6 monarchs and served under 12 different prime ministers. In his own words, spoken to Harrow School students in 1941, "Never give in. Never, never, never. In nothing, great or small, large or petty, never give in, except to convictions of honor and good sense.